The large mansion stood bright that evening, its tall glass windows glowing with golden lights. Expensive cars filled the driveway, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses came from inside. The billionaire who owned the mansion loved to throw such parties, showing his wealth and making sure people never forgot who he was. That night was no different. The grand hall was decorated with crystal chandeliers, golden curtains, and tables full of food that looked like a feast for kings. Guests dressed in expensive suits and gowns moved around, greeting each other with practiced smiles, sipping fine wine, and whispering about business deals and fortunes. At the center of the hall stood a grand piano. It was not just any piano but a rare, shining black instrument worth more than most people's houses. The billionaire loved to keep it polished so it reflected the lights above. For him, the piano was not only a musical instrument but a symbol of his taste, culture, and money. He liked to sit at it sometimes, tapping a few notes to impress his friends, though he was far from a real musician. Still, no one dared to say otherwise. To them, his wealth made everything he did seem greater than it truly was. As the evening grew louder, the billionaire clapped his hands, drawing attention. He loved having the eyes of the room on him. With a wide grin, he walked over to the piano and ran his hand across the keys. The soft sound caught everyone's ear. He played a simple tune, nothing too difficult, but the guests clapped anyway, pretending it was the work of a master. He chuckled proudly, then leaned back in his chair. That was when he made the statement that would change the night forever. With his glass of wine raised high, he laughed and said, "If anyone here can play this piano better than me, I'll marry them on the spot." The words rolled off his tongue like a joke, and the crowd erupted in laughter. To them, it was just another arrogant promise from a man who loved to exaggerate. Some of the women giggled, shaking their heads at his boldness, while others whispered as if secretly amused by the thought. The men slapped his back, saying, "No one here could outshine you, my friend." He soaked in their praise like sunlight. He loved the idea of making such loud claims because he believed no one could ever challenge him in his own home. Several guests, emboldened by the laughter, tried their luck. One man, dressed in a sharp blue suit, sat at the piano and pressed a few keys. The sound came out rough, broken, and awkward. The crowd laughed again, but this time at the man's attempt. A young woman followed, trying to play a small tune she remembered from childhood. Her effort was clumsy, her fingers stiff, and soon she gave up, hiding her face in embarrassment. Each failure made the billionaire's grin grow wider. He enjoyed watching others stumble in front of him, knowing it only made him look greater. "See," he said, smirking. "This piano needs more than just eager hands. It needs class. It needs me." All the while, a man stood quietly in the corner, dressed in a plain grey uniform. His job that evening was not to drink wine, laugh at jokes, or play music. He was the janitor, hired to keep the mansion clean, to sweep the floors, to empty the trash, and to make sure the party remained spotless for the guests. He carried a small cloth tucked into his pocket, ready to wipe spills or dust. To most of the people there, he was invisible. They had seen him earlier walking past with a mop bucket, and in their eyes, he belonged only to the background. He stood near the wall, waiting for when his services would be needed again, his gaze falling sometimes on the shining piano, sometimes on the people around it. One of the guests, half drunk and searching for more entertainment, suddenly noticed him. Pointing with a laugh, the man called out, "Why don't we let the janitor try? Maybe he can play." The room burst into laughter. The idea sounded ridiculous to them, almost like a circus act. How could a janitor, someone who polished the floors, possibly know how to touch an expensive piano? The billionaire laughed the loudest. "Now that," he said between chuckles, "would be a sight worth watching." The janitor froze. Every eye turned to him, some mocking, some curious. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands rubbing against the sides of his uniform. He had not expected to be pulled into the spotlight of the wealthy. His work was behind the scenes, silent and unnoticed. The suggestion felt less like an invitation and more like a cruel joke at his expense. Yet he also saw something in the guests' eyes, an eagerness to laugh at his failure. They wanted him to try, only so they could enjoy watching him fall short. The billionaire leaned against the piano and waved his hand. "Come on then," he said with a grin. "Show us what you've got. Who knows? Maybe tonight will surprise us all." The words were playful, but the tone was sharp. It was clear he expected nothing more than amusement from this moment. The janitor's heart pounded. A storm of emotions swirled within him: nervousness, hesitation, but also something deeper. Music had once been his companion, a part of his life long before he wore a uniform. The piano was not strange to him, it was something he had touched many times in years past, though no one here knew that. He hesitated, unsure if he should reveal this hidden part of himself. Yet as he looked at the crowd, he sensed a chance not just to silence their laughter but to remind himself of who he truly was. Slowly, he walked toward the piano. The laughter softened as people leaned closer, curious to see what he would do. The billionaire crossed his arms, a smug smile still on his face, certain that nothing meaningful could come of this. The janitor reached the piano, pulling the small cloth from his pocket and wiping his hands nervously. He stared at the keys, black and white, shining under the light. For a moment, he said nothing, only breathing in deeply, as if gathering courage. The room grew quieter, the tension thickening with every passing second. The janitor sat down carefully, his posture respectful, almost reverent. His fingers hovered above the keys, and the crowd leaned forward, ready to hear the clumsy sounds they expected. Some smirked, preparing to laugh again, while others whispered bets on how long he would last before giving up. The billionaire, swirling his wine glass, waited with an amused look. The sound of that first note lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. It was soft, gentle, and strangely full of emotion. Some guests who had been whispering to each other stopped mid-sentence. The janitor's hands moved again, pressing another key, then another, and soon a melody began to form. At first, it was slow, careful, almost like he was testing the instrument, making sure it would respond to him. The laughter that had filled the hall only moments earlier slowly faded into silence. People leaned closer, curious now instead of mocking. Something was happening that none of them had imagined. The janitor did not look at the faces around him. His eyes were fixed on the keys, his body slightly bent forward, as though he had fallen into a world of his own. His fingers began to move with more confidence, and the tune grew richer. The notes connected like flowing water, smooth and natural. It was clear to anyone listening that this was not a man playing for the first time. These were the hands of someone who had lived with music, who had practiced, who had felt every note deep inside his soul. The piano, so often silent and just a showpiece, was suddenly alive. The guests exchanged glances. At first, they had expected a clumsy attempt that would end in more laughter. But now their laughter had died completely. The mocking smiles slowly turned into looks of disbelief. The room that had moments ago felt loud and filled with arrogance was now quiet, filled only with the sound of music that touched the heart. The billionaire's smirk began to slip. He sat up straighter in his chair, watching closely. He had wanted a joke, an amusing performance that would add to his pride. Instead, something entirely different was taking place. His own piano, the one he used to impress people with his basic skills, was now revealing its true power in the hands of a man he had never even noticed before. The janitor's music was not just technical, it was emotional. Each note seemed to carry a story, a memory, a piece of life that words could not explain. The janitor's fingers moved faster now, gliding across the black and white keys with a grace that no one expected. The tune shifted into something deeper, more powerful. Some guests who had been holding their glasses forgot to drink. One woman covered her mouth in shock. Another guest whispered softly, How is this possible? But no one dared to speak louder, afraid to break the spell the music was casting. Even the servants in the room, those who usually moved silently among the guests carrying trays of food and drinks, stopped in their tracks. They stood still, holding their trays, watching in amazement. For once, the invisible workers of the mansion saw one of their own stand in the center, not to serve, but to shine. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably. His glass of wine trembled slightly in his hand. He tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. What had begun as entertainment at someone else's expense was turning into a moment that threatened his pride. The promise he had made so carelessly, if anyone plays better than me, I'll marry them, suddenly felt dangerous. Everyone could see that the janitor was already far beyond anything the billionaire himself could play. He had said those words with arrogance, never imagining they could come true. Now the music was making them real. The janitor still had not looked up. For him, the piano was not about promises or mocking laughter. It was about something more personal. He had grown up with music, though no one in that room knew his story. The piano had been his companion in the quiet hours of youth, his escape during struggles, and his way of speaking when words were not enough. Though life had taken him down a path that led to wearing a uniform and cleaning floors, the music had never left him. And now, with everyone watching, he let it out in full. The melody grew stronger, bolder. The keys sang like a choir, the notes weaving together in harmony. Some of the guests who had mocked him earlier now sat with their eyes wide, their pride melting into awe. A few even felt a sting of shame for having laughed at him. They realized they had judged him by his clothes, by his work, by the place he stood in the room. But talent, they saw now, was not bound by wealth or titles. It could live in anyone, anywhere, even in the hands of a man they had once ignored. The billionaire tried to regain control. All right, he said loudly, forcing a smile. Very impressive for a janitor. But let's not get carried away. His voice, though meant to sound confident, betrayed a slight unease. The guests ignored him. Their eyes were fixed on the janitor, their ears drowning in the music. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire was not the center of attention in his own mansion. The spotlight had shifted, and he could do nothing to take it back. The janitor's hands moved gracefully, telling a story without words. His music spoke of hardship, of nights when life was heavy, of mornings when hope returned. It carried the strength of endurance and the beauty of dreams that refused to die. Though none of the wealthy guests knew his struggles, they felt them in the way the music touched their hearts. Some felt emotions they had long buried, memories of childhood, of love, of loss. The piano had become more than an instrument, it had become a voice of truth in a room filled with lies of wealth and pride. When the janitor finally paused, letting the last note drift into silence, the hall was so quiet that one could hear the soft crackle of the candles burning in the chandeliers. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if they were all waking from a dream. Then, slowly, a few guests began to clap. The sound spread, growing louder, until the entire room erupted in applause. It was not the polite clapping they gave to the billionaire earlier. It was full, genuine, and heartfelt. Some even stood, giving him the kind of respect usually reserved for famous performers. The janitor sat quietly, still not looking at them, his hands resting gently on the keys. He was not seeking applause. He had only played because they had pushed him forward, because the piano had called to him. But as the sound of clapping washed over him, he allowed himself a small smile, faint but real. For once, his music had been heard, and his soul had been seen. The billionaire forced himself to clap too, but his face was tight, his smile stiff. Inside, he was boiling. He had not expected to be overshadowed, not in his own house, not at his own party. His joke had turned into humiliation. Everyone was looking at the janitor now, whispering about his talent, about how incredible he was. The billionaire could feel his pride cracking, and he did not know how to fix it. The janitor rose slowly from the piano, stepping back as though the moment belonged to the music itself and not to him. But the guests would not let him fade into the background again. People began to move toward him, eager to speak, to ask questions, to praise him. For the first time that evening, the billionaire was no longer the star of the room. The room was still filled with the echo of applause when the janitor quietly stepped away from the piano. His face remained calm, almost shy, as though he didn't know what to do with all the sudden attention. He had never been the center of a crowd like this. Usually, people didn't notice him at all. He was just the man in the uniform who swept floors, emptied trash, and kept things clean. But tonight, his music had placed him under a light brighter than any chandelier in the mansion. Some guests rushed forward, eager to speak to him. A woman in a sparkling silver dress touched his arm gently and said, "That was breathtaking. You play like a true artist." Another man, a well-known businessman, shook his head in amazement. "I would pay for a performance like that," he admitted. Their voices carried admiration, but the janitor lowered his eyes, embarrassed. He had not played to impress them. He had played because it was part of him, because music was the one thing that had never left his heart no matter how hard life became. The billionaire, however, felt something very different. He stood frozen by the piano, his wine glass still in his hand but untouched. His guests, the very people he loved to impress, were no longer praising him. Their words, their eyes, their claps all belonged to someone else. And worse, that someone was a man he had never even considered worthy of attention. A janitor, of all people, had stolen the evening from him. His face grew tight as he forced a laugh, trying to break the mood. "Well," he said loudly, "who knew the piano could sound like that? Very surprising indeed." But his voice cracked slightly, and many guests didn't even turn toward him. Their focus remained on the quiet man in the grey uniform. The janitor, still standing among them, began to feel uneasy. He had not come here to shine or to humiliate anyone. He had simply followed the call of music. Now, seeing the billionaire's forced smile and the restless pride behind his eyes, he wished he could disappear again into the corner. Yet something inside him told him to stay. For years, his talent had been locked away, unseen, unheard. This moment, though uncomfortable, was also the first time people truly saw him for more than his uniform. "Play another one," someone shouted from the back of the hall. The crowd agreed, clapping and calling out for more. The janitor hesitated. His hands twitched nervously. He had not performed in front of people for so long, and this was not a concert hall, it was a world of wealthy men and women who looked down on him minutes ago. He wasn't sure if they wanted another performance because they respected him or because they were still treating him like a curious act. But when he glanced back at the piano, something inside his chest stirred again. Music was not about them, it was about him, about what he carried in his heart. Slowly, he returned to the bench and sat down once more. The room hushed instantly. The guests leaned closer, eager to hear what he would do next. The billionaire clenched his jaw, watching in silence. The janitor placed his fingers on the keys, and once again, music filled the air. This time, he did not begin carefully. He played with confidence from the very first note. The melody rose and fell like a story, moving from gentle whispers to powerful cries. Each chord was alive, and every pause felt like a heartbeat. It was as though he was speaking in a language that only the piano could understand, and yet everyone in the room could feel it in their souls. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others stared at his hands, unable to believe the speed and grace with which they moved. The notes flowed like water, one blending into the next so smoothly that it seemed impossible for a single man to control them all. The piano had never sounded so alive in this mansion. It had been bought for display, for decoration, for shallow entertainment. Now, for the first time, it was fulfilling its true purpose. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had been proud of his simple songs, proud to pretend he knew the instrument well enough to impress people. But now, hearing this, he realized the difference between imitation and truth. He could strike the keys, yes, but he could not make them speak the way the janitor did. The realization burned his pride, and he tried to hide it with another nervous laugh. But his guests ignored him again, their attention stolen fully by the music. The janitor's second piece was different from the first. It carried energy, like a storm sweeping across the sky. The notes danced wildly, bold and fearless, yet every movement was controlled, precise, and full of meaning. The guests were spellbound. Some even found themselves moved to tears without understanding why. The music reached into their hearts, pulling out feelings they had long forgotten: love lost, childhood dreams, quiet hopes. In that moment, the walls of wealth, status, and arrogance seemed to fade away. They were no longer billionaires, CEOs, or wealthy wives. They were simply human beings touched by something greater than themselves. When the last note rang out and faded into silence, the hall once again erupted in thunderous applause. This time, many guests stood up, giving him a standing ovation. The sound echoed off the tall walls, louder than any applause the billionaire had ever received in his life. People cheered, clapped, and even whistled in admiration. The janitor sat quietly, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, humbled by the response but also slightly overwhelmed. One elderly man, a respected music critic who had been invited to the party, stepped forward. "Sir," he said with deep respect, "do you realize what you've just done? That was not just talent, it was mastery. You play like someone who has lived with the piano his whole life." The janitor lowered his head and spoke softly, his voice almost lost in the noise. "Music has always been with me. Even when life gave me nothing else." His words struck the crowd with the same power as his music. They realized then that this was not a man who had been taught by expensive teachers or trained in fine schools. This was a man who had carried music in his soul, through hardship, through struggle, and through years of silence. The billionaire finally stood, trying to reclaim his place. He forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. Well, you've given us a show tonight," he said. "But don't forget, it was all just for fun." He waved his hand as if to brush it off, but his guests didn't laugh with him. They looked at him with new eyes, some even with disappointment. They had seen his arrogance stripped bare, and beside it, they had witnessed genuine greatness from a man he had mocked. The janitor rose from the bench once more. He did not bow, nor did he demand recognition. He simply stepped back, ready to return to his quiet corner. But the crowd would not allow it. People rushed forward, asking his name, asking where he had learned to play, offering him their business cards, inviting him to future events. For the first time, the man who was always invisible found himself seen, not as a janitor, but as a musician, as a man of brilliance. The air inside the mansion had changed completely. Just an hour ago, it had been filled with loud laughter, shallow conversations about money, and the arrogance of a billionaire who believed the world revolved around him. But now, it was filled with something entirely different: silence that carried respect, admiration, and awe. The janitor had not only played the piano, he had touched the hearts of every single person in that hall. The room that had once been heavy with pride was now alive with a feeling no wealth could ever buy. The guests still stood near the piano, speaking in excited voices about what they had just witnessed. Some were still clapping softly, as though they couldn't stop themselves. Others shook their heads in disbelief, trying to process how such talent could come from someone they had overlooked all evening. "It's like the piano was waiting for him," one guest whispered. "It's never sounded so alive before." Another added, "It's as if the music was telling us stories without words. I've never felt anything like it." These comments spread around the hall, making the billionaire's face grow tighter. He forced smiles and nodded, but inside, he was burning with discomfort. His perfect night, the night that was supposed to glorify him, had slipped away. and it had slipped into the hands of a man he had mocked. The janitor stood quietly, almost embarrassed by the flood of attention. He wasn't used to this. For years, he had walked past people like these, invisible, noticed only when they needed something cleaned. Now people were looking at him as if he were someone important. His heart raced, but he tried to stay calm. He didn't play to impress them, he played because it was who he was. But seeing the looks on their faces, he realized something had changed. He could no longer go back to being invisible. Not after this night. Some guests began asking questions. "Where did you learn to play like that?" a man in a tuxedo asked eagerly. The janitor looked down and answered softly, "I never had lessons. I listened, I practiced, I felt the music." Another woman stepped forward. "You must perform somewhere," she said. "Surely, you don't just keep this gift hidden." He smiled faintly and shook his head. "Life doesn't always give us the chance to shine. Sometimes we have to keep our dreams quiet." His honesty struck the crowd even deeper. They realized he had carried this brilliance all along, silently, without recognition, while they wasted their attention on shallow displays of wealth. The billionaire cleared his throat and tried to laugh loudly. "Well, well," he said, clapping his hands together. "I'm glad my piano was finally put to good use. But let's not forget, this is still my house, and it was all in good fun." His words were meant to lighten the mood, but they felt forced. Guests exchanged looks. For the first time, many saw the difference between the billionaire's shallow pride and the janitor's genuine brilliance. No one said it aloud, but they all remembered his boastful words earlier, "If anyone here can play this piano better than me, I'll marry them." The promise hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and the billionaire could feel it pressing down on him. He wished he could take the words back, but it was too late. Everyone had heard him. Everyone had seen the truth with their own eyes. Meanwhile, the janitor sat down again at the piano, almost without thinking. He did not plan to compete, nor did he want to prove anything. But something inside him told him to play once more. His fingers moved across the keys with ease, and a new melody filled the hall. This one was softer, gentler, filled with warmth and peace. If the first song had been a revelation of power, and the second a storm of energy, this third one was like a quiet sunrise. The notes floated delicately, wrapping around the listeners like a soft embrace. The crowd grew still again, their hearts caught in the gentle flow of the music. The atmosphere changed once more. Some of the guests who had earlier been impressed now found themselves deeply moved. Tears welled up in the eyes of a few women. Men who usually prided themselves on their toughness felt their throats tighten. The music seemed to reach into the deepest corners of their hearts, uncovering memories they hadn't touched in years. For some, it reminded them of family long gone. For others, it brought back forgotten dreams. Even the servants, who had stopped working entirely, stood with soft smiles, as though the music had given them hope. The billionaire's fiancée, who had been standing quietly near him all evening, suddenly spoke. Her eyes were still fixed on the janitor, her face glowing with admiration. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, almost to herself. "This is not just music, it's soul. It's the voice of truth." Her words cut the billionaire like a knife. She had never looked at him that way when he played. He clenched his fists under the table, his pride bruised in a way he had never felt before. He wanted to stop the performance, to reclaim the room, but he couldn't. The power was no longer his to control. The janitor finished his gentle piece, and once again, silence followed before the applause. This time, however, the silence felt sacred. It was not the silence of disbelief but of reverence. People didn't want to break the spell too quickly. When they finally clapped, it was slower, deeper, almost as if they were bowing in respect. The billionaire forced himself to clap too, but he could not hide the anger in his eyes. For the first time, he realized his money could not buy what the janitor had just given freely. And no matter how hard he tried, he could not compete. The janitor stood, bowing his head slightly, then stepped back. He had given all he could that evening. He felt no need to prove anything further. The guests, however, were not ready to let him go. They surrounded him, offering compliments, business cards, and even invitations to play at events. One man whispered, "You belong on the grandest stages, not in a uniform." Another said, "The world needs to hear you." Their admiration grew, while the billionaire's frustration deepened. The promise he had made his careless challenge was on everyone's mind now. A few guests even teased him about it. "So," one man said with a smirk, "when's the wedding?" The crowd laughed softly, though not cruelly, more out of amusement at the billionaire's own words. But the billionaire did not laugh. His face turned red as he waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, come now. That was just a joke," he said. Surely, no one took it seriously. But the truth was, everyone remembered. And deep inside, he knew he had been defeated by his own arrogance. The janitor did not respond. He did not need to. His music had already spoken for him. The room no longer belonged to the billionaire, it belonged to the sound that still echoed in their hearts. And though the party continued with food, drinks, and chatter, nothing could erase the memory of the moment when a man they had overlooked became the star. The party eventually moved on, but the mood inside the mansion was no longer the same. The food and drinks remained untouched by many, and conversations, though they continued, always circled back to the janitor and his music. The grand piano, once just a symbol of wealth and decoration, now seemed different in their eyes. It was no longer the billionaire's toy but the voice of the man who had made it sing. People whispered in corners, some amazed, others humbled. A few even admitted openly that they had been wrong to laugh when he was invited to play. "We thought it would be funny," one guest said quietly, "but it turned out to be the most beautiful moment of the night." Those words spread, and the billionaire heard them too, each one striking at his pride like a hammer. The janitor had returned to his quiet corner, trying to avoid the overwhelming attention. He was not a man who sought the spotlight. For him, music was never about fame or applause. It was about honesty, about speaking feelings that words could not carry. Yet, for the first time in many years, people were truly listening. They looked at him not as the man who cleaned floors but as someone extraordinary. That realization both warmed his heart and frightened him. He wondered if tomorrow they would remember him the same way, or if he would return to being invisible once the excitement faded. The billionaire tried hard to recover his place. He raised his glass, made a few bold jokes, and tried to direct the attention back to himself. But no matter how hard he tried, the guests' eyes always drifted back to the janitor. Even his fiancée could not stop glancing at the man who had just transformed the evening with nothing more than his hands on a piano. She looked at him with quiet admiration, and the billionaire noticed it. That stung him more deeply than anything else. His wealth, his mansion, his expensive clothes, all of it seemed powerless in front of the raw truth of talent and soul. As the night wore on, some guests began leaving. But they left with a story on their lips, a story they would tell others, the story of a janitor who played like a genius. Many shook his hand before leaving, offering kind words that he accepted humbly. "You'll be famous after tonight," one man said confidently. "The world needs to hear you." The janitor only smiled softly. Fame was never his dream. All he had ever wanted was to live with dignity, to carry music inside him, and maybe, just maybe, to share it when the world gave him the chance. By the next morning, the story had already spread beyond the mansion. Some guests had taken videos of the performance and posted them online. Within hours, people across the city and even further were watching clips of the janitor playing with passion and skill. Comments poured in, "This man is incredible. Pure genius. Talent can come from anywhere, look at him." The videos were shared again and again, turning the janitor into an overnight sensation. The billionaire, meanwhile, woke up to headlines he never wanted to see. Billionaire mocked, janitor played like a genius. His name was in the news, but not in the way he liked. Instead of being praised for his wealth, he was being ridiculed for his arrogance and careless promise. The janitor, on the other hand, was invited to interviews and performances. Music schools wanted to meet him, event organizers wanted him on their stage, and ordinary people wanted to hear his story. For the first time, his phone rang with opportunities instead of silence. He accepted some invitations carefully, never forgetting where he had come from. Each time he sat at a piano, he remembered that night, the laughter, the mockery, and the way it had all changed with a single note. He carried that memory like a reminder that true worth comes not from titles or money, but from what lives inside the heart. As weeks passed, his life transformed. He was no longer just the man who swept floors. He became known as the man whose music could move souls. Yet, through it all, he remained humble. He never let the praise make him proud in the way the billionaire had been. Instead, he used his gift to inspire others. He visited schools, where children who dreamed of music but had no means of learning looked up to him with hope. He told them, "Never believe you are too small to be great. Music, like life, belongs to everyone. If it is in you, let it live." Those words gave courage to many who felt overlooked. The billionaire, meanwhile, found his pride shattered. For a long time, people teased him about his foolish promise. "When's the wedding?" they would joke, reminding him of the night he had been humbled in front of everyone. He tried to laugh it off, but deep inside, it gnawed at him. He could not escape the truth. In one night, all his wealth and arrogance had been outshone by the simple brilliance of a man he had once mocked. And though he continued with his life, something inside him was never the same again. He learned, in the hardest way, that money could buy many things but never talent, never respect, and never the admiration of a soul that speaks through music. The janitor's journey only grew brighter. Invitations came from faraway places. Concert halls that had once seemed unreachable now opened their doors to him. People from all walks of life came to hear him play. They weren't drawn by fame or glamour, but by the purity of his music. Each performance reminded them that greatness can be hidden in the most unexpected places. He carried himself with the same humility as always, never forgetting the uniform he once wore, never forgetting the years when no one saw him. In the end, the night at the billionaire's mansion became legendary. People told the story again and again, how a man with no riches, no grand titles, and no place among the wealthy had walked to the piano and played like a genius. They told it as a lesson, as inspiration, as proof that dignity and brilliance can never be buried forever. For the janitor, it was not about revenge or pride. It was about music finding its way into the world, about truth shining brighter than arrogance. And though the billionaire's words, "If anyone can play this piano better than me, I'll marry them," were never fulfilled, they remained a symbol of the night. Not a promise of marriage, but a reminder of how arrogance can fall in the face of true greatness. The janitor had not only played better than the billionaire, he had played in a way that touched lives forever.